what we've done locally here in Australia is to look at what was being done by EAA through its Young Eagles program. We looked at what AOPA was doing through its STEM programs, and we've built a hybrid of both. So we have a situation where we've just acquired a big road coach, a big 14.9 metre bus that we've branded up with AOPA. We've filled the bus full of flight simulators, and we drive to locations all over Australia. And in the last 12 months, we went to 36 locations across 6 states. And considering the size of Australia, it's a very, very big undertaking. I had to volunteer 30-odd weekends of my time to go support it. But luckily, what's been happening is as I've kind of been pushing and getting that enthusiasm in there, others are coming on board and saying, hey, Ben, the enthusiasm is great. Let's do this. We can make this happen.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 89 of the Aviation News Talk podcast. I'm your host, Max Truscott. Today we'll be sitting down with Benjamin Morgan. He's the Executive Director of AOPA Australia, who I met while I was in Australia a few weeks ago. And if you're not from Australia, well, you might be thinking maybe this isn't relevant to you and the country that you fly in, but I'd like to suggest that it actually is. Over the last couple of years, I've heard from many of you who live in Australia who have told me that general aviation has been shrinking there, in part because of tough safety regulations. So I think this is a cautionary tale for all of us to carefully watch the regulations in our own countries to make sure they don't become too onerous. Plus, I think you'll want to hear some of the unique programs that Ben and AOPA are putting in place to reignite growth in general aviation in Australia. But first, if you're new to the show, we have a weekly news show that shares general aviation news and well-researched pilot safety tips, and it's our goal that you always find at least one new thing each week that you can learn from the show. Now, the show is free, and if you just found it, please click on the subscribe button because that improves our rankings versus other aviation podcasts, and it increases the chance that others will find the show. And if you like the idea of a show without advertisers that's 100% funded by you, the community, please check out our Patreon page where I post interesting videos and other stories that I find between shows each week. And if you feel that you get value out of this show and you're in a position where you can spare a few dollars a month, well, we'd love to have you as a supporter of the show. We currently have 175 supporters, and I'd like to get one more supporter so that we can make 176 before the end of the year. And if you'd like to be that supporter, go to our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and be an awesome supporter of the show. Now listen to our conversation with Benjamin Morgan. Well, I'm sitting here in Sydney, Australia with Benjamin Morgan. He's the Executive Director at Aircraft Owner and Pilots Association for Australia. Benjamin, thanks so much for taking me out to lunch.
Yes, no problem at all. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here.
And why don't you tell folks where we had lunch and what we did?
Well, we came down into the city today to Chinatown, which is a real multicultural area of Sydney, and we went up to the Dragon restaurant for a classic Sydney yum cha. So it was a fantastic lunch.
And we're sitting here in our broadcast booth. Tell us exactly where the car is parked so people know where we're sitting.
So we're actually sitting down by the foreshore in an area which is called White Bay, and we're looking across at the moment at beautiful P&O Pacific Eden, which is one of the cruise ships that come in and out of the terminal here. But this is actually it's quite an interesting area, an old area of Sydney that has everything to do with shipping and transport, and it's an area that's undergoing fairly radical redevelopment. So it's off to the left there, we can see there's going to be a lot of apartments and new opportunities there, and of course the cruise bay terminal directly in front.
Well, Sydney is lovely. I've had the best time here the last couple of days, just checking everything out. But let's talk a little bit about general aviation. I think probably some folks know that Australia is roughly comparable in size to the lower 48 of states of the United States. Big difference in population. We've got over 300 million people in the United States. We've got about 600,000 pilots, over 200,000 aircraft. Give us a little scale and scope of what things are like for general aviation here in Australia.
Well, look, I think first and foremost, we're a fraction of the size of the United States, and considering the size of our country, there are only approximately 36,500 pilots, and that's made up of course, our general aviation pilots and our commercial airline pilots. From that 37,000, you're looking at around about 12 to 13,000 of them are directly involved on a regular basis with GA. So it's a very small market. I think the US, it's up around 400,000 pilots or something. And of course, our aircraft ownership community then is even smaller again. So we have on the Civil Aviation Safety Authority registration records, there are about 14,500, maybe 49,000 registered aircraft, of which there are probably only in the realm of around about 8,000 VH general aviation aeroplanes. So around about 8,000 aircraft, 12 to 13,000 pilots, a very small market.
Let's just talk about flight training and renting aircraft and things like that. If somebody were interested in becoming a pilot in Australia, how do they go about that? What are some of the challenges, and how does that get done now?
I think first and foremost, I really want to convey that Australia is a magnificent location to go flying. We are incredibly blessed to have great weather, great locations. Being an island continent, we have some of the most beautiful and picturesque coastal scenery. So coming to Australia to fly is definitely, it should be on every pilot's bucket list. Having said that, there are some challenges in that because we don't necessarily have aircraft in locations all around Australia. We have General Aviation tends to cluster into populated areas. And of course, there are going to be some challenges for pilots coming into Australia and obtaining a CASA license so that they can actually go flying on their own. But overcoming all of those hurdles, there are some great opportunities to see some truly outstanding places.
Benjamin's friend Gavin has just joined us in the back of the car and brought us some drinks. So, Gavin, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
So we're sipping on tea and coffee right now. So this, I've got to say, so far I'm liking this General Aviation experience. you people definitely have a nice, relaxed, enjoyable way of life. So,
well, I think in reference to that, what really needs to be understood is that general aviation in Australia is a very small family. Mm-hmm. We all tend to know one another, and I think you are right. I think that GA is very, very. It's very close. People tend to get along with each other, and we go out of our way to help. So it does have a very small but a very close kind of affection to it.
Well, the thing I discovered when I was spending the weekend in Orange with about 85 Cirrus pilots from all over Australia is that, holy cow, you are a friendly group of people. And I said to my wife, if we ever decide to leave the United States, Australia is where we ought to come. Look,
absolutely. And I would like to extend an open invitation to 200,000 to 300,000 American pilots to migrate across to Australia. If you'd all like to come and be based here, we would get an enormous boost in our general aviation economy, and we could do some great things. So, guys, AOPA's at the ready. We're more than happy to help every single one of you get your licenses, and we can even help relocate you into some beautiful harbourside houses. So the invitation's there.
That's great. Well, I've got to say, I have yet to see a day that was not perfect VFR. I guess it rains here occasionally, but the weather lately has been spectacular. Let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges. I had read somewhere that these were old numbers, and I think it dates back 5 years or so ago, that there had been a substantial drop in number of flight hours flown. Tell us a little bit about that, some of the factors, and has that changed, or are things still on the decline?
Look, I think to answer that, we'll put it into two particular responses. The first response is that we are starting to see areas of general aviation which are in a recovery phase. But unfortunately, on the whole, the large, predominantly the largest component of general aviation is really suffering. With our general aviation charter industry, for example, across the last 10 years has halved. That's not a small drop, a 50% reduction in overall activity for charter. And that's being driven, of course, by a multitude of factors. The largest factor is regulatory complexity, regulatory cost, impost and compliance. Unfortunately, and again, Max, we could spend hours talking about all of these issues to do with the regulations in Australia, but what we have is we have a situation where the charter businesses really can no longer afford to do the things that they were doing 10 years ago.
Let me just make sure I understand. When you say the charter business, you're talking about what we would call Part 135 in the U.S., where people hire an aircraft to take them from point A to point B?
Yeah, so you go in and you basically would arrive at a location, you'll book an aircraft to do a particular flight. In Australia, that's defined as a charter operation, and those companies are required to operate under a particular AOC. And, of course, the Part 135 rules in the United States, we're in the process of undertaking a Part 135 reform here in Australia as well. And so we're going to see an even deeper tightening to the rule sets there. So we've got some real challenges and some real hurdles in the charter industry segment, and that's not a very pleasant picture. Outside of the regulatory context, there's also been an impact of ageing aircraft. We can't deny the fact that Cessna are not building twins. Piper are no longer building the bigger twins. Most of the aircraft that are now available within the general aviation context for charter operations are turboprops, the King Airs and the PC-12s and the Caravans. And so these are high capital cost assets that take fairly deep pockets to acquire. And in a small country like Australia, where most of the businesses are very small, those capital acquisition costs are out of reach. And so these are all contributing factors that are hurting us. And of course, the third thing, which is becoming more of a problem now, is the global pilot crisis. So right now, right around the world, we have the a growing situation where we are unable as an industry to supply the airlines with the number of pilots that they need to continue domestic and international operations at the level we are today and growing it into the future. And so what we're starting to see over the last 3 to 5 years is a greater number of charter operators losing all of their lower time pilots as they're now reaching out and starting their careers in the airline industry. And so there's a lot of work to be done from a regulatory perspective, an aircraft manufacturer's perspective, and a pilot supply line perspective to get this particular segment of our industry back moving again. And I would think that many of these challenges are also being replicated right now in the United States. And I see a lot of information from AOPA out of the US on these concerns. And so we're comforted in one essence that these are not challenges that are just being felt by Australia, but also we're inspired because we've got the United States as a resource to lean on as well to understand how they are seeking to meet those challenges and then to work that into our own advocacy pathways here.
So let's talk about the weekend pilot, folks that want to fly a 172 for fun and recreation. Is that portion of general aviation declining or increasing or about the same? And how do people go about finding an aircraft to rent if they don't own one?
Look, the sad truth is that in Australia, and I think it's also the same in the US, is that we're seeing a decline in private pilots. Something's changed. Something's changed in the way in which youth look at aviation. Something has changed in the way in which those of us that still like to think we're youthful are looking at aviation, and those that have maybe even been involved in aviation, how they continue to see aviation. I think it would be replicated. Same in the US. Obviously, Mark Baker and his team are trying to meet some of these challenges, but the real question is, how do we revise the business model of general aviation, and how do we revitalise private interest in aviation as a pursuit? And I think that in order to answer some of those questions, what we need to do is we need to start thinking retrospectively as to how we approach the paradigm of private aviation from the 1960s forward, but also to look introspectively in terms of how do we improve ourselves as an industry to capitalise on new opportunity. And so if we look at what we were doing 30, 40, 50 years ago, the industry was promoting on an international level a sincere message of private aviation unlocks opportunity, private aviation unlocks potential. We saw aircraft manufacturers running ads in newspapers and in non-aviation centres of information, stories on loading your Bonanza up with your kids to go play a round of golf or go to a ski weekend. And we had these great iconic 1960s illustrations of the private aircraft parked next to the private vehicle in a holiday destination with the wife and kids and the bags. And so we as an industry were promoting aviation not as a technical asset, but rather as a solution to a population challenge. And that challenge at the time was that cities are located great distances, business is located at great distance, you can become the flying businessman, you can become the flying family. And I think it's fair to say that right throughout the 1960s, this was prevalent not just in aircraft advertising, it was prevalent in motor car advertising, it was prevalent in the American dream advertising, it was prevalent obviously in the aviation world. And so we've got to look back at some of that stuff and start asking ourselves, how do we re-inspire a future generation to look at aviation the same way as we inspired a generation in the 1960s to do so? And so part of that solution then is the introspective view in terms of what are the things that we're doing today that is delivering the wrong message, and how do we take responsibility for that messaging and correct it. So making certain that the industry's constantly putting its best pair of shoes on, taking its best step forward, wearing its best suit and clothes, making sure that we deliver a clean and respectable and opportunity-based image rather than an image of an industry in crisis and industry struggling. But therein lies a challenge too, because organisations like AOPA, for example, we have this split role. On one side of the argument, we've got to maintain a vigilant opposition to over-regulation, complexity and cost, and that requires us to have a very negative language. But then on the other side of the fence, we've got to maintain a very positive message, which is all about opportunity, growth and development, and the two unfortunately don't always meet, and sometimes it can be very difficult to be the same person that delivers both messages. So general aviation has challenges. I think that those challenges are not impossible for us to surmount. I think it's attitudinal. We have to take a really long look at what we want to achieve over the next 10 years, and we have to design a plan to get us there. No different to Kennedy launching the race to space. We have to set the goal, we have to fund the goal, we have to deliver a plan to achieve the goal, and then make sure that we achieve it so that we can then accomplish the tasks along the milestones and obviously inspire people to really get behind it.
So let's talk about the two different messages separately. Let's talk about the positive side first. What do you see as kind of the key opportunity to get more people into aviation and to grow the industry?
Well, there's an old adage in just about every industry, and that is, one man's loss is another man's gain. And right now, there is an enormous amount to gain from the fact that the industry's devalued. And so I was actually speaking with one of our young members who sent me this wonderful text message. A big shout out to Stephen Limkin. Stephen Limkin's one of our AOPA members here in Australia, and he's actually involved in the media and film production industry. And Stephen went out and obtained his recreational license. So in Australia, we have a recreational and then we have a private pilot's license. So we got a recreational license, but I got this message yesterday, probably at about 9 o'clock, saying, "Hey, Ben, I just bought my first aeroplane. I bought a Cherokee." He paid $20,000 for it. And it belonged to another one of our members, David Tennant, up at Warnervale on the Central Coast. And it was a great little machine that David had I believe his son learnt to fly in the aeroplane. And so Steve's acquired his first Australian registered aircraft. He's over the moon. He's a young guy. I think he's like 26 or something, 27. And here he is. He's now involved in general aviation and he's living the general aviation dream. Private aviation that takes him around the country, and he is able to open up his business, and being a documentary filmmaker, he can go to locations and he can do things that otherwise the car won't allow him to do. And so here we have a prime example of the positivity and how positivity can drive an outcome. And that was AOPA working with Stephen, publishing materials through our website. And he made a particular reference to the fact that he said, "Ben, I really enjoyed the recent articles and editorial that was put together on aircraft ownership because it helped me understand." And so I think that the solution is right in front of us, and I think that the answer and the outcomes will immediately follow. But we've got to be really driven in this. We've got to become the completely obsessed, determined and tenacious organisations just trying to get as many people into aircraft ownership as possible.
Now, as we were driving to the restaurant, you and Gavin and I were talking about a number of different things, and you were talking about youth initiatives. Give us a little bit of insight into your view of what we need to be doing globally to try and bring more people into aviation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I mean, you'll hear this as a common theme. If you, obviously, you're around EAA, you're around AOPA, all these organisations in the US, what you hear from them all is about youth. We've got to get kids involved in aviation. And I personally hold the same view on this. And when I joined AOPA 2.5 years ago, I made it very clear that my time with the organisation was going to be spent on getting a genuine youth engagement program and an initiative up and going that wasn't just going to be a Sydney-based initiative, but we needed a national initiative. We needed a way of inspiring Aero Clubs and flight schools and private owners to be part of the solution to save general aviation from decline. And so what we've done locally here in Australia is to look at what was being done by EAA through its Young Eagles program. We looked at what AOPA was doing through its STEM programs, and we've built a hybrid of both. So we have a situation where we've just acquired a big road coach, a big 14.9 metre bus that we've branded up with AOPA. We filled the bus full of flight simulators, and we drive to locations all over Australia. And in the last 12 months, we went to 36 locations across 6 states. And considering the size of Australia, it's a very, very big undertaking. I had to volunteer 30-odd weekends of my time to go support it. But luckily, what's been happening is as I've kind of been pushing and getting that enthusiasm in there, others are coming on board and saying, "Hey, Ben, the enthusiasm is great. Let's do this. We can make this happen." To complement the bus and the simulators, we're in the process of setting up a whole stack of fully refurbished and restored Cessna 150s and 152s. And so when we go to locations around Australia in support of fly-ins, advanced aero clubs, flight schools, all that stuff, we'll be able to work with kids and get them on the simulators. And the reason we use the simulators initially is that the children of 2018 and beyond speak a digital language. They understand technology. This is part of their, I call it the daily diet of information absorption, right? So the Kellogg's box of information absorption for these youth is technology, whether it be through their iPhone or be through their laptop or desktop computer, or whether it's through the flat screen televisions today, which are becoming just as smart as a computer. These kids understand that. So we use that digital computer environment to immediately draw them towards us at a trade show. We get them sitting in front of a computer, and of course they've never flown an aeroplane before, and they get presented with a joystick, and they can understand through some very quick education the principles of how an aeroplane flies and how the effects of controls work, and then we get them going. From there, what we're looking for is we're looking for the children that are of an age which they can start the process of learning to fly. And then we encourage those individuals to show us where mum and dad are. And then we do a quick meet and greet with mum and dad. And then we convert them by saying, listen, we'd love to get your son and daughter or family joined up to AOPA. And if we did that today, would you like to take your first flight in a light aircraft? And so then we take them up in an aeroplane. They have a great experience. And from there, we hope that the flame is lit and we can inspire them further. But in order to do this on a national scale, it requires support between AOPA and all of our partner organisations. And so we work in direct partnership with our Sport Aircraft Association peers. And in Australia, the equivalent of EAA is an organisation called the Sport Aircraft Association of Australia. We also work in partnership with the Gliding Federation of Australia. There's an organisation that looks after all the aircraft maintenance and LAMEs, and so we work in partnership with them as well. And so our initiative is not just AOPA, it's about pulling together all of the principal leading organisations for a combined targeted effort. And so whilst that will work on a national scale, what we really need to be achieving is we need to achieve a global result. And that is, if we have a look at, for example, just the AOPAs, we're very proud in Australia that our AOPA was the second AOPA in the world. So AOPA USA was formed in 1948. We were formed in 1949. And then, of course, the others flowed on. And it was, in fact, AOPA Australia and the US that formed the International AOPA Council. So our two organisations, separated by vast distance, saw a need to create a vehicle for a global initiative to bring together the brightest minds of the general aviation fraternity and community and develop global policy initiatives to help cultivate and also protect general aviation. And I think that an important part of our youth efforts here in Australia also need to be driven through the international AOPA fraternity and also the international EAA fraternity and others, so that we can start collectively pooling our resources and build a national global website, resources and materials, so that we have a common message and a unified message in every country. So it's all achievable. I think that all of the ingredients and all of the capability is sitting right there in front of us. What we now need to do is come together as a global community and say we're going to solve the challenge.
Now, you'd mentioned earlier that you've just purchased a Aerobat, a Cessna 150, and that you're looking to acquire some others and use that as a way to get more youth opportunities to fly in airplanes. Tell us why that's important, because apparently it's difficult for people to find a flight school today and fly. I've heard that most of the flight training is often associated with companies that are doing airline flying.
Yeah. Flight training in Australia has gone through some real ups and downs, and unfortunately one of the effects of the transformation of general aviation over the last 10 years has been that our flight training industry, the smaller players within our flight training industry, have been unable to survive. And unfortunately in Australia, I say unfortunately, there is a side to this which is positive, but there's also, we need to recognise there's a side to this which is negative, and that is over the last 10 years, a significant number of our larger flight training companies have all been bought out by Chinese funded interests. And so right now, for the first time in the history of this country, we are starting to get to a point where the majority of flight training schools are actually training pilots for China and Asian nations. And so Australians are not being trained. Now, this is, of course, an enormous opportunity because it's bringing millions of dollars worth of investment and money from the Chinese government and also from the Chinese carriers. And that is effectively helping stimulate the GA economy because they're purchasing new aircraft, they're setting up maintenance facilities. But the problem is that these are very introspective organisations. They work with themselves for themselves. Pilots that they train go abroad. They don't stay here. And so what we need is we need to find the balance. We need greater investment in local flight training. But to get that investment in local flight training today is very difficult because the costs involved in setting up a flight training school under CASA's 141, 142 structure is just simply too high. You and I were having this discussion over lunch, independent flight instructors. It was reported to AOPA Australia a couple of years ago that 75% of all flight training conducted in the United States is conducted by independent flight instructors. And it makes sense. And it makes sense for very good reasons. And that is, independent flight instructors have the ability to be everywhere. You can be an independent flight instructor and actually have a job elsewhere. You can be a guy that works in IT. And on the weekends, you've got a love affair of aviation and you go out there and you're happy to train kids to teach them to fly, and you're not really interested in making huge buckets of cash out of it because you're feeding a passion. You're feeding something that you just get enormous enjoyment out of. And at the same time, you're creating an enormous positive output, which is to see others being given the gift of flight which obviously we know lasts a lifetime. So these independent instructors within the US are just an essential part of that economy. And the FAA had fed back some information to us here that if you removed independent flight instructors from the US economy, flight training would collapse. Well, that's exactly what we've seen take place in Australia, because we actually did have independent flight instructors up to 1989. And if you have a look at the graph of pilot training and growth in pilot training hours and pilot numbers, up until about 1989, we were experiencing growth. And beyond 1989, we hit the cliff. And so as a consequence of removing independent flight instructors, the organisations which are most heavily impacted are your local flying groups and aero clubs. And in fact, I travelled all the way to South Australia. So I did 2,500 kilometres of driving in 2 days to go pick up this little aeroplane, which came back on a trailer. And I ended up meeting up with a whole bunch of guys at a place called Narra Court, which is the southernmost part of South Australia. And we're there having a lunch with these guys. And one of the guys said to me, Ben, we have to get independent flight instructors back because all of our instructors have left. We've got guys here that are capable of instructing but will not spend $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to set up a flight school. They just want to go get current again and teach kids. And so these clubs are suffering. And so clubs that once upon a time had 120, 130 local pilots who then actively hired aircraft, which then created flight hours, which then created maintenance business, which the maintenance then created jobs for apprentices, which then created jobs for parts and supply. All of that has dried up because of this one decision in 1989 to remove those instructors. So when I give presentations in the industry and I talk about the challenge of aviation, I'll often talk about the ecosystem of general aviation. In that general aviation is actually a completely symbiotic ecosystem environment where if you affect one element, it will create third, fourth and fifth order effects that sometimes you can't quantify. And by the time you do quantify them, you have to realise that you've actually drastically upset things. And it's probably very similar to the challenge we have with the Great Barrier Reef here in Australia. And all the time the environmentalists are talking about the Great Barrier Reef in terms of, you only need to affect the salinity of the water or the acidity of the water, and all of a sudden then it is affecting certain coral species. And if that coral species dies, it no longer gives birth to this spawn. And if that spawn's not in the water, then this other fish life will never have a chance of surviving. And so they're able to explain very carefully that the environmental impacts of removing something can devastate everything. And I think that's exactly what's happened in general aviation in Australia, in that through a consequence of a decision to remove something as fundamental as a independent flight instructor has created an environment where small clubs and locations in regional Australia just can no longer function as a place to train pilots. And I think to put my best analogy to it would be this: how successful would a yacht club be if it had no yachts? And that's what we're expecting of aero clubs nationwide. We're expecting general aviation to survive, but if you have no aircraft and you have no pilots, aero clubs simply can't exist. So to make it work, we've got to get back into the business of training, and we've got to unlock the potential of training by empowering as many individuals to play that role. And I'm always inspired when I hear people talking about the US, because in the United States, I believe you guys can take retired airline captains and you can get them into an instructor rating very quickly. They don't need to hold a commercial medical, class 1 medical. They operate on a class 3 medical, I believe. The US view the student, if he's got a medical, then the instructor doesn't even need one effectively. I mean, it seems to me that the United States has a very pragmatic and a very reasonable and, a reasoned approach to regulation that is built to support an industry, not enforce an industry. And I think, when I'm often asked about the difference between the US and Australia, my simplistic answer is, well, I see the US as supportive, where I see the Australians as being oppressive. And so there are two paradigms. The oppressive nature of CASA is designed to protect you from injury by forcing you to comply, whereas the United States ideology of safety is to support your education and learning, support you as a pilot in a business so that you can afford to comply and maintain safety. And they're two very different approaches, and I'd have to question whether our approach is actually that successful at all.
I'd like to get to regulation in a moment, but you brought up Aero Clubs, and that's something that we have relatively few of in the U.S., and I think the nature of the ones that we do have is probably different than what you have here. Take just a moment and tell us, in general, what is an Aero Club and what kind of functions and organizational activities occur through Aero Clubs in Australia?
So Aero Clubs traditionally in Australia came about through the same way that AOPA was formed, when you bring a group of like-minded people with a passion and common interest to cultivate that and build community. And AOPA was formed in Australia in 1949 to protect general aviation by a group of highly experienced general aviation pilots who are all former wartime pilots, people who understood that for general aviation to succeed, it has to be protected. Because if you allow, and in fact, the Americans would know this better than anyone else, if you allow your government free rein, then you'll be subjected to tyranny, okay? And so if you allow a government to do its job within tight controls, then what you have is freedoms, okay? And so the American AOPA was formed around the concept of your freedom to fly, and it's still their motto to this day, your freedom to fly. It's about protecting that freedom because it's a freedom we all want. So Aero Clubs were essentially formed for the same reason. It was about bringing local communities together to protect freedom to fly by promoting freedom to fly. And so they're made up of local aircraft owners and pilots, local businesses that might have owned aircraft, and back in the 1950s and 60s, they also would have included a lot of the GA business owners as well. So they became a melting pot, a mixing point of capability, talent, experience, opportunity and growth. And so Aero Clubs quickly evolved through the 1960s, 70s and 80s to become bricks and mortar facilities located on airports with great outdoor entertainment spaces, kitchens, function rooms. And for all intent and purposes, they were the earliest predecessors to the FBO. Right? The Aero Clubs would own aircraft. You could proudly become a member of a club and the club would own 10 or 15 aeroplanes, and on the weekend you didn't need to own a Cessna 172. You went out to the Aero Club and you booked it, you took your mates flying. And it's a very successful model, and in fact the model is really no less successful today than what it probably was in the 1960s, except that the cost of owning an aircraft in Australia has been made catastrophically expensive. The cost of maintaining an instructor rating has been made catastrophically expensive. The cost of setting up a flight training school and maintaining that flight school is almost near impossible now. And so whilst the model, which is community, bringing like-minded people together, interest and cultivation of that, whilst that still exists, the economic forces which have driven the costs of these other elements has actually overridden all of the positives and has actually driven the Aero Club movements into vast retreat. And so we have hundreds of locations across Australia which are now just a building. They're the yacht club with no yachts. You walk into the building and they've got these great old picture frames and honour rolls, and you walk in there and you see heritage and history and all of everything that made up the greatness of our industry stuck to the walls in black and white. There's no people. And there's no people because how many people can you honestly join to a yacht club an Aero Club if you can't teach them how to fly? And so the sad part is that the Aero Clubs became, in many instances, Aero Clubs evolved to become charter operators. They were actually a principal backbone to the general aviation industry. And in fact, in Australia, we had a network of Royal Aero Clubs. So the Commonwealth had this thing called the Royal Aero Club scheme. And so the Queen bestowed royal status on an enormous number of aero clubs around Australia. And I think to this day, there are now probably only 2 of these left out of an entire national network. They've all just dried up. So it's sad to see, but I think the community of aviators is still there. The people are still there, but the costs have gotten out of control, and that's stopping the average person from being involved. So some great work that needs to be done. You've asked me about the aeroplanes, and I think it ties into this discussion, and that is we've also suffered a bit of our own wrongdoing here. And over the last 10 years, a lot of aircraft manufacturers got out there to sell new aeroplanes and convinced a lot of aero clubs that the way of the future was to buy brand new aeroplanes. Now, there's a bit of a difference. A brand new aircraft today versus what a brand new aircraft cost you in the 1960s are actually 2 completely different prices. An average businessman in the 1960s could buy an aeroplane. You cannot do it today. I mean, you would understand, Max, very well. I mean, a Cirrus in Australia is a $1 million aeroplane. A $1 million aeroplane. Now, the car, our recording studio here, mate, is a $60,000 car. Right? It's the equivalent of what a Bonanza was worth, right? It's not $1 million car. And so herein lies a great problem for Aero Clubs, and that is how do we attract people to want to fly and participate if our aircraft are not what people want them to be. And so this has been a real interesting area to explore as my time with AOPA, and I've spent a lot of time listening to Aero Clubs tell me about what they think they need. They'll all tell you they need glass cockpit. They'll all tell you they're going to need the latest and greatest, and they're all going to tell you they're going to need things with leather seats and all the rest of it, because that's what they think the market wants. But really what the market wants is just affordable flying. And I see Aero Clubs that go out and spend $160,000 on a two-seat training aeroplane. And I scratch my head and I'll say, oh, but we bought this $160,000 aeroplane because it has a Rotax in it and it only burns 16 litres an hour. And we can provide it to the student for a little bit less than what we were providing a 152 for. And you sit there and you think to yourself, yeah, you probably can, but you've now only got one aeroplane, whereas when you had your 152s, you had multiple. And so you're reducing your capability to reduce your fuel burn slightly. And so I think it's a bit of a false economy. And I think that what we're doing is we're penalising ourselves and we're hurting ourselves. I said earlier, there's never been a greater time to buy a General Aviation aeroplane, and we're proving it. You know, you can buy a Cessna 152 airframe for $10,000. You can put an overhauled engine, a fresh coat of paint, and an interior in the aeroplane and spend $60,000 all up. Now you've got a virtually brand new Cessna that is a proven, dependable product that's reliable, that'll give you another 10 or 15 years of service, but it has a third of the capital cost of a $160,000 aeroplane. Okay, it burns 25% more fuel. Well, that 25% is still leaving you 50% in front of where you would be if you'd bought a $160,000 aeroplane. The economics simply don't add up. And whilst clubs will certainly justify it by saying, but we've got to have new aircraft, you've got to question the thinking in that. I mean, that's like someone saying it's only acceptable if you drive a $200,000 motor car. Well, how long would you be selling motor cars for in Australia if every person had to buy a $200,000 motor car? You'd send the motor car industry broke. And that's exactly what we've done, is we've sent the Australian general aviation industry broke because we've stopped refurbishing aeroplanes. We've stopped investing in older aircraft, and we're buying into this belief that we can just all have new airplanes, and the lending facilities just don't exist in Australia for it. The economics don't support it, and it's very difficult to amortise a $160,000 aeroplane into a 5-year return. You know, you tend to find you start banking into the false economy of saying, well, we'll amortise the aeroplane over 10 years. Well, that's fine, but you've got no idea whether your business is going to be around in 3 years, let alone 10. And so what happens if in 3 years' time something happens and you can't? You know, I think that we've got to get back to some basics, and I think that's what AOPA is doing in the US with its 152 Reimagined program. So it refurbishes the 150s and the 152s. It goes out and it works with Aero Clubs to say, listen, calm down. You can have a slightly older aeroplane that's refurbished, save a ton of money, get your members flying again. And what do we know? I mean, Max, what do we know? If you're a pilot and you get flying in a cheap basic aeroplane, what do you want to do as a pilot?
Well, of course, you want to upgrade to something faster and, of course, more expensive.
So if you're a pilot and you've had access to cheap aviation and you've been able to accrue hours and gain your experience and get yourself up and going, you're going to be more likely to invest later. But if you're a pilot, as we see in Australia, there's so many young people start and they're paying $350 to $400 an hour to go flying. So, I've got a young partner. I'm 39. I don't consider myself to be too old, but I've got to be honest. For the first time in my life now, I've got a partner saying, how much money do we spend in aviation? You know, we want a family. We can't keep flying if we want a family. We're going to have to justify. So I'm going through the very thing that causes our industry to lose so many pilots. And so, you know, for me, if I were in a position where I could be a member of a club and I could easily access a $90 an hour aeroplane, I would stay involved in aviation. I'd continue flying. I'd continue to be active, whereas right now what happens is people just depart. They just pack up and they leave, and then we don't get them back for another 10 or 15 years until the families settle in. So it's part of that challenge, part of that paradigm is making aviation far more accessible again by getting back to basics.
So let's go to the dark side for a moment. We talked earlier about regulation, and you said as we were driving off to the restaurant that even if we fixed all the problems with regulation, that in itself would not solve the things that need to happen to grow general aviation. So with that as a given, just go ahead and tell us about some of the regulatory challenges, some of the things that you would like to see fixed, even though they're in and of themselves not the end-all solution.
Well, I think that let's recap the statement, and that is, it certainly is my view that whilst, especially in my role with as Executive Director of AOPA, every day of the week I'm involved in a regulatory debate. It's a fair statement that globally, aircraft owners and pilots want rules relaxed. We are operating in an environment where we're just simply facing too many regulations. And realistically, aircraft ownership is no different to car ownership. And in fact, I saw a video on Facebook last night, and it really got me thinking about this, and that is our Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, who's also our Transport Minister, has recorded a video standing in front of the cameras saying there's a day apparently this month called Yellow Ribbon Day, which is in remembrance of everyone killed on the roads in Australia for the last year. 1,200 people killed. Out of a population of 25 million, we've had 1,200 and something people unfortunately lose their lives in motor car accidents. Well, in that same year, how many people have we had lose their lives in aircraft? Substantially less. In fact, there wouldn't even be 10% that have unfortunately lost their lives in aircraft accidents. And so then we start to ask ourselves a question, well, who are we kidding? There are always going to be accidents. The motor car industry shows us that. Cars have gotten far safer than they've ever been. ABS, traction control, airbags, computer engineered safety cabin design, to such a point that the glass panels now form part of the reinforced structure. And it's amazing just how far automotive technology has come. And yet with all those advances in technology, people are still getting killed on the roads roughly in the same percentages and the same numbers that they've always been killed. That's a very interesting question. Why? Why are people always getting killed in transport equipment and vehicles? And I think the answer to that is we are all fundamentally flawed in that we're human. We all make mistakes, but the mistakes can't be regulated out. You would have to be insane to believe that you can regulate someone from making a mistake. Think about the types of mistakes that we're all making on a daily basis. Inadvertent, completely unaware of where we're heading towards that mistake, but then we make it, we realise we made a mistake, we call ourselves a klutz and we move on, right? That's happening in aviation all the time. And we see a huge number of accidents that we as pilots look at, and later, we all do it. We see the accident on television, it's on the media, we're all sitting on the chat forums and Facebooks watching the comments, and then the reports start to come out, and then we say to ourselves, how did they do that? Why did they do that? How did he put himself in that? How did she put himself in that position that accident mode would take place? And so I fear what's happened in aviation is that whilst we've increased our regulatory complexities, we have, from a regulator's perspective, they have sought to try and tighten every possible mechanism within the system to prevent every perceivable manner of incident, that those incidents themselves have continued. And they are going to continue because people will invariably suffer time pressure. They will suffer moments of judgment failure. They will suffer moments of total stupidity where they just go blank and something happens where they let that aeroplane get right in front of them. We see it all the time, flying into cloud as a VFR pilot. Every pilot is taught from the moment we get in an aeroplane to stay out of cloud as a VFR pilot and not to get yourself into IMC, yet it happens all the time. How can we possibly put more regulations in place? Right, so then we get back to what I was saying earlier about the US system being a supportive system versus an oppressive system. Maybe the answer to the regulatory paradigm is not regulation itself, but education and support. Now, I'm quoted quite often in the talks that I give that I say, safety is never achieved through regulation. It's only ever achieved through training, competency and education. You cannot teach someone regulation, but you can teach someone skills to keep them away from danger, skills to keep them out of danger, all that type of stuff. So in terms of the regulatory debate, it's my view that we could argue for a 100 over 100 result. We could have every element of regulation we want solved. but that will never fix the safety culture of aviation. And so even if we did do that, I think it's a waste of time. I said the biggest area that I think we can have an impact on aviation is to encourage regulators to transition towards a supportive education and awareness platform in which our pilot community is offered and provided a lot more in terms of support. And I think if we achieve that, then we'll see safety actually reduce. And we were talking at lunch about a very unfortunate accident we had here in Australia, where we have this crazy regulation in Australia that when an aircraft gets to the end of a 12-month calendar period, it has to go in for an annual. These annuals have been around since forever and a day, and I've heard all manner of debate on this, like should an aircraft be annualled every year? Should it be annualled every 2 years? How long's a reasonable period for an aircraft to be annualled? But in Australia, unfortunately, this accident occurred where we had a pilot where the aircraft was coming up to the end of its annual. He had bad weather in the weeks leading up to the fatality where he couldn't get away. And then the weekend he decided to leave, which on the Monday, the aircraft was expired. It must go in for maintenance. And he departed that weekend in terrible weather conditions against the better judgment of his support network at his local airport and flew into a mountain, into a tree, and lost his life. That was a completely avoidable, unnecessary fatality in aviation that demonstrates that even when we create regulations that demand that pilots don't fly into bad weather, that demands that pilots do adequate pre-flight and planning, that demand that aircraft be maintained to strict schedules, that what we end up doing is creating third and fourth order outcomes that create the very thing that we were actually attempting to prevent. And so, if we achieve a 100 over 100 per thing outcome on regulation, what's it going to change for the industry? I think it's going to change a great deal. The way we change our industry is we start supporting the industry, we start promoting the industry, we start educating the industry, and I think through that we'll see huge change.
So let's turn back to the fun, positive side of flying. Yep. If an American or anybody from anywhere around the world wanted to come down to Australia and rent a plane and fly around, how would they go about doing that?
So the great news is if you have an American private pilot license, you are able to convert that to a CASA private pilot's license. You will need to do this prior to arriving. Please do not turn up to Australia thinking I'm just going to convert this license and go flying that weekend. There's a bit of time involved and there are some hoops and things you've got to jump through to make it happen. We can actually assist you with that process. So if you're an AOPA member, reach out, make contact with our office in Sydney. You can do that. You can contact us via the website, so www.aopa.com.au, or call us directly, and we can actually send you a fact sheet on how to convert your license. And we also have some flight instructors that are within our organisation that we can then connect you with, and if necessary, they can also help guide you through. So once you step through those steps and you get yourself a licence issued, obviously we get you out to Australia. We need to get you to a flight school or an Aero Club where you'll then do a checkout in an aeroplane, and once you've been checked out, you can then hire the aircraft and go flying it. Once you're off and going in Australia, there are some magnificent places to go to, and a lot of Americans love going inland to the outback to see what outback Australia's like. Australians love to go coastal because we love beaches and we love those coastal cities and locations, but there's everything in Australia to see. Frankly, I've been fortunate enough that I've had the opportunity of flying through the US, and it's great. You guys don't have the coast that we have. We've got just absolutely amazing coastal locations. And if you get north up towards Queensland, being able to fly out and around the Great Barrier Reef and see some of the things up there, it's just phenomenal. It really is.
So I looked into this before I came down, and I was surprised to find that you've talked to me for a few minutes. You probably think I'm proficient in English. Apparently, CASA doesn't believe that I'm proficient in English. What does one have to do, even though they speak English perfectly as their first language, to overcome that barrier?
Yeah, that one's just total stupidity, isn't it? I mean, I don't understand it. CASA have imposed this English-speaking language test, which I believe is about maintaining an ICAO compliance. It's crazy. We've got third, fourth and fifth generation Australians that have to get their license and have to sit an English test. I mean, it's nuts. That's one of the things I think we can solve, but It's also reflective of the fact that we now live in a time where multiculturalism is as strong as it is, and so there's no guarantee that just because you're Australian, you're English speaking. And so there are changes occurring within our industry now that are a broader change, a reflection of the broader changes happening within the society of Australia. So it's frustrating. I can tell you there's a lot of Australians who speak English, albeit with a few slangs and lazy tongues, but they have to sit their English language test just like anybody else. And yeah, it's interesting. The other one we've got as well as which is really bizarre, is we have this thing called an ASIC card. So if you're a pilot and you're going to fly to a location in Australia in which a RPT, regular passenger transport service, is functioning from, you have to be security vetted. And so to hold an ASIC card, you've got to apply for this identification card through a complex process in which they do a terrorism background check, they do policing background checks. It takes about a month to get this thing organised. You're looking at $200 to $300 Aussie dollars to get the card issued. It's only valid for 2 years. And without this card, if you land at an airport that has an RPT service from it, you technically can't leave your aircraft unless you're being escorted. So it's just a peculiar thing. And in fact, I'm often saying this to CASA and the minister that, you know, the only nation in the world that has genuinely had a terrorism attack using aircraft is the United States, and they don't have it. And yet here in Australia we've got it. You know, who are we protecting ourselves from? I mean, it is just, you know, it sits in parallel in terms of the acts of stupidity against aviation. And I think we can laugh about these things, because if you don't laugh about them, you probably cry. Acts of stupidity against our industry, you know, includes ASIC cards, which it's protecting nobody. It's helping government ministers feel like they've done something to protect the Australian public, when in fact it's proven so far that they're useless in protecting anything. The second thing was, and I'm not sure if this has happened in the US, but our government had a big knee-jerk reaction to 9/11, and it put fences around all of its airports. And it's spent hundreds of millions of dollars putting fences up around these airport locations. And you go to these country locations and you look at the fences and you think, my God, what a fantastic fence that is. But then the fence only goes halfway around the airport because that's all the budget extended to. So if you're a terrorist, all you've got to do is walk around the corner. So our industry, certainly not. We don't escape the acts of stupidity against us by government and tyranny. And I think it might be the same in the US, I don't know.
Okay, so for all terrorists out there, no, I'm kidding.
Don't participate in our industry. If you're a terrorist, go away, right? We want our industry back.
So as we start to wrap up here, any things that we haven't talked about that you'd like to bring up and talk about?
Look, I just think that general aviation is just a great industry. And I think my personal opinion is, I think it has a very positive future in front of it. I know there's a lot of discussion in terms of the things that we have wrong with aviation, but there are solutions, and the solutions are achievable. As I say here in Australia, to activate those solutions, we need two things. We need the political imperative. We need the politicians to understand that it's actually worthwhile seeking the change. And then what we need is the government regulatory imperative. So political will drives regulatory will because it controls it. But unfortunately, from time to time, the regulatory will supersedes the political will. So this is the challenge of creating change in general aviation. But, you know, look in front of us right now. There goes a young boy on his scooter. We need young boys and girls all around the city having little model aeroplanes and, you know, aviation artefacts and bits and pieces that inspire them. I look across at these fantastic parklands, and I think to myself, AOPA needs to be doing a better job of engaging with local councils, so that when councils build play equipment, there's a piece of play equipment that's an aeroplane. We need to take the attitude of creating aviation everywhere if we're to achieve the change we need, because we are facing a period of time in which very much today we are consumers. And kids becoming involved in aviation are the ultimate consumers for some very powerful, very wealthy and highly predatory brands and organisations that want their business and want their money. And I keep telling flying schools this: you are not just competing now with an 18-year-old boy or girl wanting to buy a car or have another hobby in their life. You're competing against young people who are spending thousands of dollars on mobile phone technology. They're spending hundreds of dollars a month on that mobile phone technology. They're spending thousands on their laptop. They're spending thousands on their car. They're spending thousands on clothes. They're spending thousands on their mountain bikes. They are spending thousands of dollars on everything that they're doing in life now, where that did not happen in the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s, or even the 90s. And I was in school in the 90s, right? And I can tell you, I did not have a mobile phone in school. Right? And yet you go to a school today and they've all got mobile phones. I see young people today and they really don't know what they don't know. They've got so much today compared to what we had 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years ago. And that has come from somewhere. And of course it comes from mum and dad. Now mum and dad are obviously footing the bill for this. So when the kid comes to mum and dad and says, I want to learn to fly as well, what's mum and dad saying? Yeah, you know, can't you play soccer? That sounds awfully expensive. How about I buy you a bike? So we're competing in that space. And so we've got to think like these big multinationals that market to these kids and sharpen our value proposition, our value reasoning, and also sharpen our image and our product delivery skills if we're going to compete. So the solutions are there. We don't need to look that far to understand how we can apply them. We only need to look to other successful industries that have overcome these challenges. And yachting went through this. So yachting in Australia went through a period where people stopped buying boats. And the yachting industry was in real crisis. And what it actually realised was that it was going through a period where there was a whole bunch of buyers of boats who had never been buyers of boats where the numbers of youth involved in sailing had deteriorated 20 years before. And so 20 years later, there was just simply not enough interest in buying boats. And so Yachting Australia did a fantastic job of focusing yacht clubs on creating communities of competition and engagement within youth, and so that there are thousands and thousands of young kids involved in junior sailing events. So what happens to those kids 20 years later? And so we've just come through a period now, after all the work they did in the 80s and the 90s, that all of a sudden there's now boat owners that are 30 and 40 years of age that are out there spending 100, 200, 300, 400, 500,000 on a boat. And, I'm lucky. I've got a yacht here in the city that we keep on the harbour, and just about everyone in my community at the yacht club can well afford a General Aviation aeroplane. But when I mention General Aviation, they say, oh, isn't it ridiculously expensive? And I chuckle. I think, you've got to be kidding me. Yeah. Is that your boat? We can get you an aeroplane. So look, looking at those external markets, understanding that we've got to get outside of aviation in order to grow aviation, marketing aviation to non-aviation people is where we need to be, and also being pragmatic in terms of growing the aviation enterprises and businesses, not overcommitting ourselves to super expensive new aircraft, learning to utilise every tool and resource we have in the box to achieve the outcome. And, if we do it right, in 20 years' time, we can all have new airplanes,
So certainly there's strength in numbers, and I'm sure AOPA would like to have as many Australian pilots or non-pilots be members as possible. Tell us just a little bit about AOPA, where people find out about it, the benefits.
Yeah, sure. Well, fundamentally, Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association in Australia, as it is in the United States, is entirely funded and supported by its members. And the members comprise of aircraft owners, pilots, aviation business proprietors, people who are actively involved in aviation. In Australia, our organisation, this is by comparison, I think the US AOPA is a couple of 100,000 members strong. We have now got 3,700 members. What an achievement, in terms of numbers. When I joined AOPA, that number was, we were well down. We were well below 2,000 members. So it's taken a big effort over the last year and a half to get that membership growing again. But we're just about to close off 2 continuous years of month-on-month growth, which is great. It's good to see our associations getting stronger again. And we're running all kinds of initiatives and programs. So we've started the relaunch of AOPA in Australia with getting our youth program going. Next year, there will be a delivery on junior pilots initiatives, Pilot Safety Training Foundation, a whole bunch of things that we're doing there to improve our members' participation and involvement in general aviation. And if people want to know more about us, the best place to go is our website, www.aopa.com.au. And anyone's welcome to become a member. If you're a member in the US, you're not automatically a member in Australia, because technically we are 2 different organisations, even though we're under the one banner. But we would encourage, if you've got an interest in coming to Australia and you want to learn more about being part of it, join AOPA Australia. Join for $129 and become part of what we're doing. And, when you make your way to Australia, make sure you stop in and you see us, because we are a great resource and we'll go out of our way to help.
That's great. Ben, thanks so much for your time. This has been very informative.
Thank you so much, mate. And thank you very much for being here in Australia. We love it.
Well, I'm having a great time and hope to come back again. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And you can really hear Benjamin's passion for general aviation come through. And I was very impressed with the work that he and AOPA in Australia are doing to get more youth involved in aviation. Now, by the way, I kept the recorder running both before and after our interview as he was driving us through downtown Sydney. And you can hear part of that conversation between Benjamin and his friend Gavin at the end of this episode. And remember, for more stories and videos, just go out to our Patreon site, where I'll be posting a video of kangaroos running by. I did that because I've talked with numerous Americans who visited Australia and never saw a kangaroo. So while I was in the town of Orange, which is where the Cirrus pilot proficiency program I attended was being held, I asked around and I learned that the roos could often be found at a local golf course. I don't know why, but watching them bounce as they ran by me, I thought was just quite comical, and I hope you enjoy the video. And while you're there, please consider becoming a new supporter for the show. You can find the Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and there's also a link to it in our show notes. And as regular listeners to this show know, if you think that someday you might buy a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me today. I can help arrange a free demo flight if you're thinking about a new Cirrus and can help you understand all the different factors involved in buying new versus used. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with pilots around the world. And finally, the most important thing that you can do to help this show is just to show one other person, just one, maybe a friend of yours, how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they're not familiar with what a podcast is, well, probably the easiest way to get them started is just to send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, which is where they already go to get their new apps on their phones, and get them to search in the Play Store or the App Store for Aviation News Talk. Then just download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS or Android. And did I mention? Yep, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. Well, except for our aerobatic friends, you can keep the dirty side up.
So the answers are there, Max. The answers are right in front of us. What we need to do as a global initiative, and hopefully we can start to do this through international AOPA, is start to get all of the global markets to come to the table and say, well, what's working? Let's develop a national framework and a national policy for engagement, and then actually utilise the global resource of funding, posters, engagement materials, resources, websites, and all of the things that we need to be able to genuinely engage. Because if we rely on each of the countries individually, no one can afford to do it. And so we've got to start thinking globally in solving our local problem, if you can kind of paraphrase it that way. You know, the thing is, aviation's worth it. It's worth pursuing. It's worth cultivating. It's worth fostering. I mean, there's a podcast. I was interviewed by the ABC, and I can send it to you. I've got the audio recording. It runs for about 20 minutes, and I talk about the challenge of aviation. If we look at it, if we stand back as aviation people away from our own industry, and we look at aviation from an ordinary person's perspective, what we have to accept is that it's not as glamorous as it used to be. If an airline pilot today walked down the street, no one would give it a moment's thought. And that's because we have effectively commoditised aviation to such a point now that it's just part of ordinary life. Whereas in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, commercial aviation travel was still something that very few people were actively involved in or had the experience of. And I remember taking my first flights in an Ansett, which was an airline here in Australia, an Ansett 727, flying between Sydney and bloody Tasmania, and it was just the most exciting thing in the world, getting on an airliner. It was, and as kids, we were treated unbelievably. You know, we got on board the aeroplane, and we got the Ansett Junior Flyers pack, and it had a little ruler in it, and it had puzzles and games, and it was all about fostering and promoting this almost romantic view of aviation being something that was just so adventurous and so much fun.
But that initially triggers your interest. You need something that actually puts you on the path to getting through to a career in aviation.
But Gavin, you think about kids today. Kids will get in an airliner today and none of it, they're just treated like a cattle. Just get on, take your seat. I mean, I flew Jetstar recently to Bali and I was mortified. I had the worst airline experience of my life with Jetstar. And that was, we paid what I think middle of the road prices. It wasn't the cheapest, it wasn't the most expensive. We were on a beautiful new 787, which was exciting as an aeroplane guy to fly a 787. And I have to say, Boeing, hats off, what an amazing product. But we're midway through the flight, it was pretty damn cold. And my partner Laura was getting a bit chilly. So I said, could we get a blanket? And they're like, yeah, that's $25. And I said, I don't want to buy the blanket, I just want to use the blanket. And they're like, no, we don't give you blankets anymore because we have to pay to clean them. And so it's a lot better for us if you buy it. And that, to me, it typified, Max. It typified. That was the moment I realised.
It's not about you.
This is the problem with aviation: is there's no glamour left in it at all.
I think you can underline that's corporate for you. It's not about you. It's about us.
Yeah.
It's about profit.
So anyway, out of frustration, I'm like, bugger it, I'll buy the blanket. So I bought the blanket. That was $25. I bought maybe 3 or 4 drinks on the flight. That was another $40. I bought 2 sandwiches on the flight, which added another $35. Yeah. By the time I finished, I'd spent like $100 odd on board the aeroplane on a credit card. And I was just sitting there thinking to myself, hang on a minute. So I've bought my own iPad with my own movies, with my own earphones. I've bought my blanket. I've bought all this stuff on board the aeroplane. I'm like, wow, these guys have really worked it out, haven't they? Some of the things that I think, though, that the negative in that is I understand why the airlines have done that, because the airlines are gutting the cost structures out of it in order to provide the cheapest possible airfare. Yeah. But in the process of gutting the activity of the experience, in reducing it to a cost experience, and that's what it is now. When you fly today, you're having a cost experience. The airline has designed their product now so that what you think about is you think about price. You no longer think about the experience at all. I'm getting a cheap flight, I've saved money. It's no longer about I'm taking a flight, I'm off on an adventure.
Yeah, it's a form of transport.
So what they've done, though, is they've created an environment where for kids it's no longer enjoyable. It might be exciting that they're on the aeroplane, but they lose all of that opportunity that otherwise engenders the airline. I still, to this very day, have my Ansett Junior Flyers kit. I've still got it all. I've got the rulers, I've got the crayons.
You're a freak, mate. That's just...
Yeah.
You can keep all that stuff.
But what it did is it created such a positive memory for me that every time this stuff's come out of a box to be thrown away, I look at it and go, no, I don't want to throw that away. It's something special for me because I remember those flights, right?
Yeah, I remember those little plastic wings they used to give you.
But in the same context, I now remember my Jetstar flight, but I don't remember it for the right reasons. And I can guarantee you I'll keep that blanket, but not because I had a great experience, but because that blanket's going to last a lifetime so that it's worth what I paid for it.
It's going to have to cuddle up to it for 20 years.
Thank you, Alan Joyce. Thank you for saving a buck. But, the same's happened effectively in GA as well. The experience for youth now is one where you can't get close to an aeroplane. We've built fences at airports. We're telling everyone it's a high-risk, high-security environment. And so kids no longer have playful, carefree, emotional memories of airports. They view an airport as no different to this bloody car park. Pay a fee, we might let you in. There's nothing fun about that. There's nothing exciting about going into a car park, and that's what
security risk and proven otherwise. What's it like in the States? What's the youth engagement thing like in the States?
So the biggest program we have in the States is sponsored through EAA, the Experimental Aircraft Association, and that's the Young Eagles program. And there are chapters around the United States, which will go out on a Saturday and fly, 15, 20, or 100 kids, depending upon the number of people there and the location. And it's just a way to give teenagers a free flight and exposure to what it's like to fly in general aviation. And they're well over the 1 or 2 million mark at this point. The program's been running probably for at least 20 years, and there have been a number of success stories where people are now airline pilots who initially had that flight and were inspired by, that initial flight in a Cessna 172.
That's great.
That Young Eagles program is just, it's real inspirational stuff, and that's what we're trying to model our junior pilots around right now. But, it's hard. They're lucky they've got such a base in the US to make it happen from.